I want you to take a deep breath. Yes, because I'm going to ask you a question that will send you into a real mess. Political history is more important than cultural history because it's driven by this question. It's not over yet. God forbid anyone steps on the edge of our country, we'll be in deep trouble. In our Arab world, in our current situation, there is no ruler like this. You see my ruler as a disaster. You see him as a devil incarnate. That's your problem. But for me, what could be better? I mean, it's true he rules the country with an iron fist, but even while ruling with an iron fist, he is keen on its strength, elevation, and advancement. This exists. We Muslims, how did we deal with the civilizations of other nations? Muslims didn't come close to destroying these things, nor did they deal with them in the fires or with kindness at all. My brother, you develop this psychological condition. The moment you see a church, you turn it into a mosque. This didn't happen. What's happening to you, whether on the level of jurisprudence, meaning how we should treat the peoples whose lands we conquered, or on the level of history, this doesn't exist. Muslims deliberately destroyed churches. No music. Peace be upon you, my brothers, wherever you are. This is the 7th episode of the 100 Questions. In History series, we have reached question number 17. Question 17. Of course, in this series, we always welcome our regular guest, Professor Muhammad Al-Harni. Welcome, Professor Muhammad. May God elevate your status and bless you. May God protect you. We are always enjoying this series with you. We always discover something new through the questions you pose and your rich assignments. May God elevate your status. We ask God to benefit us and you with what we say and here, ready for question 17, we put our trust in God. Question 17 says, meaning we know, of course, also again, that our mother who enters like this and takes control and begins to expand, meaning she deals with or nations differed in their dealings with a story of the cultural heritage. What is it? I have entered your place. What do you have? Castles, palaces, infrastructure, what, etc. How will I proceed with libraries, with your mosques, churches, whatever? Yes, and thus nations differed, but many of them, and what's shocking about the issue dealt with it, meaning the achievement of expression with barbarity, not ordinary. I mean, the nation of Islam, the Muslims, was one of these nations that spread and expanded and worked and had conquests and so on. We Muslims, how did we deal with the civilizations of other nations? A Persian civilization, the Indian civilization, the Roman civilization, the Phoenician civilization, any of these civilizations, the Pharaonic, the Babylonian, and so on. How did we deal with these civilizations? Beautiful, in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, and praise be to God, and prayers and peace be upon the messenger of God, and upon his family and companions, and those who follow him. Look, sir, I also always try to get to the questioner's mind, meaning what's going on in his mind and what made him ask the question in this way. We have things, I mean, we can say their famous experiences in dealing with the previous heritage. One of three things. The first thing is the way the Mongols dealt with it. The Mongols, for example, when they entered our Islamic lands and even non-Islamic lands, they entered. The Tartar invasion is called the Tartar invasion and the Mongol invasion because of the extermination, destruction, burning, and disrespect shown to everything in their path, including books, sciences, and knowledge. While it's true that the Tartars and Mongols were indeed barbaric, this wasn't their consistent policy. We must remember that any people who have managed to build and maintain a state are not purely barbaric. A degree of intellect and the ability to learn from the achievements of other peoples are essential. However, the Mongols, for example, were known to abduct Scholars, craftsmen, and useful people from any country they conquered, taking them to their own lands and destroying the rest. This destruction sometimes involved excessive force, including the annihilation of sciences, knowledge, and other things. Ultimately, sometimes used to instill fear. Sometimes people's hearts turn against them because they despise this particular heritage or this nation. Sometimes they destroy sacred things to weaken this nation. For example, when we see the Quran being burned or desecrated, they wanted to do that. This is one example of destruction, burning, and sabotage. Another example is assimilation into the vanquished. Assimilation into the heritage of the vanquished. This happens often. A nation may be advanced, but weakness, luxury, prosperity, and corruption have crept into it, causing it to be defeated. Militarily, it is defeated militarily by peoples less civilized than itself. Most nations that have been defeated were defeated when they were invaded by peoples less civilized. Civilization, luxury, and prosperity corrupted them, weakened their strength, and diminished their power. Therefore, they became vulnerable to attacks. So, when a people, let's call them barbarians, meaning those without a cultural background, enter a land with a heritage, a rich civilization often finds itself absorbed by the culture of the vanquished, drawing inspiration from their civilization. A prime example is when the Romans conquered Greece and adopted Greek civilization, even though they ultimately defeated them. This pattern has been repeated many times among Muslims. The Mongols invaded militarily, but eventually converted to Islam and absorbed our culture. The Crusaders, after defeating us militarily in the Levant, also learned from our civilization. The Spanish in Andalusia followed suit. This illustrates the idea that a superior civilization, conquered by a less civilized people, results in the assimilation of the victor into the vanquished. This phenomenon exists throughout history and has been particularly prevalent in Islamic history. The third point, as mentioned in the previous episode, is that it was an Islamic exception. Muslims remained for centuries in other lands and diverse civilizations, but it was the people of those lands who absorbed the civilization, even over time. So, when we ask what Muslims did with the heritage of these previous nations, some people ask this question with the question, what did they do to the churches? What did they do to the libraries? What did they do? Scholars of this caliber, including Muslims, never approached the destruction of these things, nor did they ever deal with them in a way that would embarrass, corrupt, or otherwise harm them. Even the famous claim about the burning of the Library of Alexandria, meaning that no one is discussing this claim anymore, was an old one that was refuted. The Library of Alexandria was burned before, and it was never proven that Umar ibn al-Khattab or Amr ibn al-As burned or ordered the burning of the Library of Alexandria, which contained the essence of Greek and Roman sciences at that time, nor do we hear that Muslims gathered the scholars of other peoples or demolished their churches or destroyed them.
أو على مستوى التاريخ لا يوجد فيه هذا إنه المسلمين تقصدوا هدم الكنائس أو
This never happened. In fact, what is found in our Islamic heritage, whether in jurisprudence meaning how we should treat the peoples whose lands we conquered or in history, is not that Muslims intentionally destroyed churches or monasteries. No, this never happened. Even to this day, people debate why Muslims didn't destroy the pyramids and the Sphinx. The pyramids are indeed, the Sphinx wasn't extinguished. It was buried during the time of the Muslims. But I want to say that whoever is asking this question now is aware that the Muslims didn't destroy the monuments or relics of previous nations. That's good, but let me digress a little here. What is the exception to this rule? The exception is when something is an idol being worshipped. Islam came to liberate people from idolatry. So, the
فالأحجار المعبودة حصل إنه المسلمين هدموها
Muslims did destroy these idols,
تهريما لما يعد
not in the sense of destroying them for the sake of vandalism, but rather in the sense of destroying their
هنا برضو يا أخ مراد في حتة
idolatrous meaning. Here, too,
غريبة عن الذهن ويعني مناسبة جيدة إن إحنا
escapes
نضيفها
our
في
attention,
تبشير
and it's a
إيمان.
good opportunity that we've reached it. Let me point it out.
لما كان الرئيس
This issue was raised when President
أرجع مسجد آيا صوفيا
Erdogan was here in Turkey and he converted Hagia Sophia back into a mosque. You know that Hagia Sophia
المسلمون حولوها إلى
was a church. When the Muslims conquered it, they converted it into a mosque. Then, during the era of Mustafa Kemal, it was converted into a museum. Then Erdogan turned it back into a mosque. This sparked the question, why do Muslims, when they conquer a country, convert it into a mosque? Why do they convert churches into mosques? How do we explain this? I'm not trying to answer that now. I'm trying to explain how to explain this. Churches at that time were symbols of the old regime in modern terms. What does that mean? For example, when the Americans entered Baghdad, they didn't destroy mosques, but they did destroy Saddam Hussein's statue. They seized the presidential palace, not the Grand Mosque, and they took control of the parliament, not the Islamic library. Why? Because it's natural that anyone who wins, whether they're victorious or defeated, takes control of the centers of power and politics. The symbols of the old regime at that time were churches and mosques. We are now in a secular era. So because we are in a secular era, we see, understand, or comprehend that it's natural for them to take control of the parliament building, the headquarters of the ruling party, the presidential palace, and to destroy the symbols and slogans of the old regime. These are the slogans and symbols of the old regime. Therefore, it was permissible for the Muslim conqueror to take the country he conquered by force. A country that surrendered was not to be protected in its churches, but rather in the lives of its inhabitants, as agreed upon, meaning the jizya agreement, the surrender agreement. But the country that was conquered by force, meaning the killing before we conquered it, 100,000, 20,000, 50,000, 100,000, it was perfectly natural that the declaration of victory, the declaration of dominance, was to take this symbol of the old regime, seize it, and convert it into a mosque. This is what the Muslims did, and this is what non-Muslims did. This is what people still do today. But because we are in a secular era, we no longer see that the parliament and the presidential palace used to resemble the old Grand Mosque or the Grand Church. So, I want to say that an exception to what I'm saying is that it was possible for something to be demolished or destroyed when it was a religious symbol opposed to Islam in the countries that were conquered by force, countries for which Muslims sacrificed thousands of martyrs and lost a lot of money. So, it shouldn't be understood that this is dealing with a heritage that doesn't understand that this is a policy of conquest, meaning a policy of victory in wars. Okay, but after a policy of victory in wars, the libraries remain. Their scholars, priests, monks, and rabbis are still there. No one is harming or damaging the property. Therefore, Hagia Sophia, because it was an imperial church, yes, that's a very important point. Controlling it was necessary, yes, exactly, just as people now easily accept the takeover of the presidential palace. People in the past easily accepted the conversion of a church into a mosque, and even the conversion of a mosque into a church when the Christians were defeated. Yes, okay, but, for example, did the Muslims burn manuscripts like the Christians did when they seized power? No, that didn't happen. Did the Muslims throw libraries into the street or rivers like the Mongols did? No, that didn't happen. Or, for example, did they demolish Hagia Sophia? They didn't demolish Hagia Sophia, for example. Okay, therefore, this is regarding okay. Another person is asking this question, and in his mind, I am telling you that the first question is, what have we done with libraries, books, and scholars? The second question is, what have we done with the values, the content, the substance that was in those books? How have we interacted with the heritage and content of these previous nations? Here we enter the issue of cultural exchange and influence. We establish the principle that no nation has ever interacted with another without some kind of influence and being influenced occurring. We are human. When you sit with I'm Egyptian now and befriend some Syrians or Palestinians, you'll eventually pick up words from their dialect. It's perfectly natural. Any nation interacts with another. There's cultural exchange. But here, have we reached the point of cultural assimilation? Have we reached the point of influence? There's a principle here. A historian of civilizations named Marcelou used to say, and this was mentioned by the French historian Fernando Bourdelle in his book History and Rules of Civilizations, a large book translated by an Egyptian diplomat and published by the Ministry of Culture. Egyptian culture is also available online. He used to say that no civilization deserves the name if it doesn't have a tendency to reject internal contributions. Every civilization has its own distinctive characteristics. These characteristics represent constants for it. Things that don't align with it must be met with aversion, rejection, and dismissal of things related to its particularity. In other words, every civilization has a filter. It rejects some things and tolerates and accepts others. What it rejects is often related to its constants and its core fundamental matters. So now, for example, when you see how Muslims dealt with this heritage, you see that Muslims embraced it with an incredibly voracious appetite for learning about the heritage and sciences of previous nations. Even one of the Orientalists, Hempel, if memory serves, says in his book The Heritage of Islam he had research in the book The Heritage of Islam supervised by Thomas Arnold that the Arabs were exceptionally ambitious.
ده مؤرخ أمريكي من أصل ألماني وهو يهودي وهو حجة في التاريخ.
Franz Rosen, an American historian of German origin and a Jew, is an authority on Islamic history. He has a remarkable book. Historiography is the science of history among Muslims. He translated Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah into English and also translated part of al-Tabari's work into English. Importantly, one of the famous figures was speaking about the dynamism Islam instilled in the historical movement of Muslims. He said that a Muslim's religion is rich with history, and what is mentioned in the Quran and Sunnah made them eager and ambitious to satisfy this historical instinct that arose within them as a result of their religion. The Muslims, he said, gave to the historical movement what no one else gave. The Muslims, because they wanted to follow the Quran and Sunnah and understand what was mentioned in the Quran about the stories of the prophets and the relics of previous peoples, or the things that the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, related, were driven to learn what other peoples possessed in terms of knowledge. That is why the Prophet said, narrate from the children of Israel, and there is no harm in it, and he said, narrate from them, but do not believe them nor disbelieve them. Therefore, from the beginning of the Islamic scientific movement, Muslims wanted to collect as much knowledge as possible and benefit from it. In their collection of this knowledge, the translation movement began during the Umayyad era. Translation began during the Umayyad era, and it flourished and reached its peak during the Abbasid Caliphate. When Al-Mamun established the House of Wisdom, he considered it the equivalent of Harvard University in modern terms. While Harvard has its counterparts, the House of Wisdom was unique. Unlike anything in America, such as Silicon Valley, it was a university dedicated to translation, and he funded translators. Sometimes, he even collected tribute in the form of books from countries or the Byzantine Empire that entered into agreements with him. He would say, we don't want money, give us the books you have. Much has been written about the House of
من فصول
wisdom, a
حضارتها
shining chapter
الإسلامية.
in
وما كانش مجرد مكتبة.
our Islamic civilization. It wasn't just a library, it was an academy with scholars, teaching facilities, and an astronomical observatory. As I mentioned, the circumference of the earth was measured during Al-Mamun's reign. Therefore, there was a strong desire to absorb the knowledge of our predecessors. This strong desire to absorb the knowledge of our predecessors was and selecting are significant practices, and this is most evident in the fact that Muslims translated many things from the Greeks, especially the works of Plato, Aristotle, Hippocrates, and Euclid. We mentioned in a previous episode that the sciences were mixed. They weren't translating philosophy alone, but rather medicine or logic sciences in general. All of this was found in a single book, so they translated everything. Although they were interested in translating Greek works, they didn't translate, for example, Greek mythology, myths related to the gods, their conflicts, their disputes, the god of beauty and the god of evil. The Muslims didn't translate these. Therefore, the truth is that the Muslims had a certain degree of self-confidence and pride in their religion, and at this level, they translated, or rather, claimed to translate. So, does this mean that nothing corrupted was transmitted to us at all? No, it did seep in. It seeped in, firstly, because this is a human endeavor, and secondly, because many of the early translators were non-Muslims, Christians, the Sabians, and the people living on the borders of the two civilizations, those who knew the two languages, Arabic, Syriac, and Greek, and so on, also seeped in because the sciences were mixed, as we mentioned. So, it's true that there was seepage, but the things that clearly contradicted the Islamic religion or the Islamic heritage were not translated by Muslims. Therefore, you find Persian heritage translated, Indian translated, Greek translated, Roman translated, Christian and Jewish translated, and Hebrew translated, and we did not attribute any of this to ourselves. We did not attribute any of this to ourselves. And after that, the translators began to correct each other. That is, the natural scientific process occurred. This translation is not accurate. This translation needs correction, and so on. So, in short, how they dealt with the heritage was a selective approach, the selection of those confident in themselves. This does not preclude the fact that things that contradicted it entered our civilization for the reasons I mentioned. So, another group of Muslim scholars took up this task, such as the entry of logic, which was saturated with Greek philosophy, or the entry of chemistry saturated with Greek philosophy, with magic, talismans, and the introduction of astrology steeped in astrology. All of this was mixed up. Some Muslim scholars rejected it, some refuted it, and some said, no, this is foreign, this is not permissible. Some were influenced by it. Some saw it as something like logic. For example, people still see logic as a science that should be rejected altogether, and that it is a Greek construct, a construct that Greek civilization used to confront the sophists. Others see logic as one of the means and tools by which statements can be distinguished, and that it is an abstract science, meaning an abstract science by which statements can be weighed. Even now, you will find, for example, Islamic sects or Islamic trends that see logic as something important, and other sects or trends that see logic as a science that is of no benefit to the intelligent. No, it is not beneficial to the intelligent, nor is it useful to the dull-witted, and the intelligent do not need it. This last statement is the statement of Ibn Taymiyyah, and the Orientalists after him had the same division. Some people see that Ibn Taymiyyah and the al-Hadith sect, meaning they were the correct view, is that this is merely a Greek science that emerged in different cultural circumstances. Some see logic not as a science by which statements are weighed, but as an abstract science that can be used as the fundamentalists did. In short, the approach to heritage involved a degree of self-importance and a degree of selectivity. For example, one of my favorite titles is Baruni's book, investigating the content of sayings acceptable to reason or reprehensible. Wow, he was talking about the religions of India, and he said, now we're going to discuss the accepted and rejected sayings of India. So, the Muslims' civilized approach to the heritage of their predecessors was generally rational and prudent. Otherwise, it's a human phenomenon, and naturally, you can't build a civilization without relying on the legacy of those who came before, because ultimately, this is human knowledge. But, Professor Muhammad, this is regarding the culture. Example I read some time ago there's news in Egypt that they demolished a dome that dates back to the time of Muhammad Ali Pasha. I think, yes, they demolished it. I mean, I can't understand how we deal with our architectural heritage in this way, while other nations have Islamic civilizations, and they preserve them and even generate income from them. I mean, if not for the sake of civilization, then for tourism. The point is, we Muslims also have a right to respect stones. How do we treat them? And speaking of stones, what I'm telling you is, you people have this psychological condition. The moment you see a church, you want to convert it into a mosque. What's going on with you? The proof is Hajar Sophia, and how many mosques like that are in Istanbul? You know what I mean? While he turns a blind eye to the thousands of mosques that were converted into churches, for example, in Spain, Portugal, and other places around the world. What's happening in Egypt is something that has no rational explanation. It really has no rational explanation. I don't know what to say because no sane person, nor a madman, would abandon history, a country's heritage, which, even from a purely materialistic, pragmatic, secular perspective, is a source of income and can generate revenue, is actually driven by an ulterior motive that cannot be separated from its hostility towards religion. What is happening in Egypt is the revival of pharaonic and Jewish heritage, the restoration of their tombs and mosques, the legalization of even illegally constructed churches, and the demolition of mosques. If a foreign occupation were ruling Egypt, it would have done nothing more than this. In any case, this is a complex and sensitive issue. But throughout history, how have we dealt with this? As I mentioned, it's not known that Muslims pursued churches, monasteries, or convents for demolition. On the contrary, many regions welcomed Muslims with open arms, most notably Egypt, whose Coptic church was subjected to severe persecution by the Church of Constantinople due to differing doctrines, saw its people welcome Muslims. What happened was that when the Muslims entered Egypt, they returned these Coptic properties and churches to the Coptic Pope Benjamin, who had been in exile. The Romans and the Desert Laboratory returned once again, and he doesn't know that Muslims pursued churches or monasteries for demolition. Rather, I mentioned that the exception to this is what happens when a country is conquered by force, and this church, idol, or building was a symbol of the ruling political hegemony. This includes everything, whether in the regions of Persia, meaning the eastern regions, or even in the western regions of the Levant, Egypt, and North Africa. Therefore, the Islamic world remained. We remember a nice statement by Dr. Abdul Wahab al-Masiri when someone said to him, "So, the Muslims in their times of supremacy did the same thing that the Westerners did in their times of supremacy." He said, "No, that's not true. You go to Europe and you only find one thing. You feel that people are even copy-pasted from each other. But come to the Islamic world, it's a museum of people." And Abul Wahab al-Masiri, even though he is held accountable for this, I will bring you, sir, a statement by Bernard Lewis. Bernard Lewis, the American Jewish Orientalist, a fanatical Zionist, and a specialist in the Ottoman state, and the Ottoman state, which, according to scholars, is considered the least Islamic version among the versions. The other, of course, is the Ottoman Empire a very great Islamic state. But what I mean is, you're saying it was the furthest removed from these conquerors in time, and its language wasn't Arabic. Regarding the Ottoman Empire, Bernard Lewis says that when the Ottomans were driven out of the regions they conquered, everything was still in its original languages and institutions, so it maintained its existence. Meanwhile, Spain and Portugal have no Muslims today. This is Bernard Lewis's statement in a study titled War and Peace in the book The Legacy, supervised by Schacht. And regarding the issue of Muslims being tolerant, there's absolutely no disagreement about that. When I mentioned George Lewin, history hasn't known conquerors as tolerant as the Arabs, nor a religion like theirs. So, you find in Islamic history, I remember a book called History of the Israelites by an Egyptian Jew named Makarios Shahin that the Israelites were persecuted everywhere they went and throughout history. When he came to the Islamic world, all he could find was persecution, just persecution, throughout the entire Islamic world. And when you look at this persecution behind them, you find them to be worthless, meaning you won't find anything in them. But in the end, he's just following them to prove what's spreading in the world of hatred towards Jews, which he didn't find in the Islamic world at all. History only mentions 2 incidents, which itself is proof of tolerance. The first incident occurred during the reign of the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim by Amr al-Ar, and this was a massacre of everyone. The second incident is in Morocco, mentioned in Ibn Abidzar's book, Ward al-Qurturs. I remember checking the sources myself, and it wasn't accurate. He mentioned that some princes in Morocco exterminated the Jews in that region, but then, a few years later, another historian mentions that the jizya poll tax paid by the Jews reached such and such a figure. This means that no extermination took place, and there were Jews paying the jizya. So, let's leave aside al-Makrizi. Al-Makrizi, the doyen of Egyptian historians, has a book called History of the Copts. Al-Makrizi died in the 9th century. In his book, I counted the rebellions attributed to Christians against Islamic rule over those 9 centuries 8 times. Some were administrative, some involved clashes, and some were social issues. But I want to say that when you find 9 centuries with 8 rebellions, meaning an average of more than 1 rebellion every 100 years, were these people tolerant or intolerant? Let me list them for you. Let me list them for you in any modern country. The data is for every year. For example, today, Professor Muhammad in India, the engineering department has filed a lawsuit against 3,000 mosques, claiming they were built on Hindu temples. That's true, if we're just making comparisons. This is the Babri Masjid, the Great Mosque. Yes, unfortunately, of course. This is an architectural masterpiece, an extraordinary civilization. Professor Muhammad, let's leave aside the Muslims. Let's just close this question and apply it, setting aside the Muslims and their way of dealing with their cultural heritage of any nation they invade. Politically, it's not like I'm the one who's victorious, so I'm the one who enters. So naturally I'll destroy your most important buildings, change your language, change your customs and culture, and falsify your heritage. I'm the one who's victorious, so why are you upset? This is what it is. This is Islamic distinction. This is Islamic distinction. The Muslims, in their initial conquests, were not merely conquerors, nor were they tyrants. They were not our new version of tyranny. You know, Brother Murad, what Abu al-Harith meant by there is no compulsion in religion. When was it revealed, or why was it revealed? You know, the people of Medina, before Islam came to them, had Jews. You know, sometimes superstitions spread among people like this. Whenever a woman became pregnant or gave birth and her child died, she would say, I will make the next child a Jew. This practice even exists in our time until now. Some go to the graves of saints, some go to churches, and some go to sorcerers. Some women in Medina would make a vow to God that if he granted them a son, they would make him a Jew so that their children would live. So a generation of Jewish children grew up in Medina who converted to Judaism in this sense. When Islam came and their parents embraced Islam, they wanted to force their children to return to Islam. Then God revealed the verse, "There is no compulsion in religion. There is no compulsion in religion." Righteousness has become distinct from error. Muslims never attempted to force people to convert. I recall a British man named Ronald Victor Bodley in his book The Prophet the Life of Muhammad, saying that Islam acts like a self-confident religion, not driven by the desire or ambition to convert none. Muslims, Islam is there. Want to join? Welcome. If you don't, that's fine. Those who go astray will not harm you if you are guided. Therefore, you won't find this level of persecution in the Muslim heritage. Muslims were not tyrants like those of the past. Now, in this series, people liked the idea of summarizing. Yes, so how did we Muslims deal with the heritage of previous nations? In one line, we Muslims dealt with the heritage of previous nations. If we want the physical objects and documents, we treated them with respect and appreciation. If we want the content, we examined, evaluated, and weighed it. Whatever was in accordance with our desires or beneficial in this world, we accepted. Whatever was not, we rejected. Question 18. Question 18. Live in this series, Professor Muhammad, this relates to something you've mentioned more than once, in various places and meetings concerning the difference between political history and cultural history. If we want to benefit from history, which one should we study? What is the definition of each? Yes, we referred to this when we entered the topic of civilization. We're reiterating it because questions can sometimes lead to forgetting each other. We said that political history is the history of palaces, the history of wars and conflicts, the history of conspiracies, the history of kings and ministers. This is political history. Cultural history, on the other hand, is the history of societies, the history of sciences, arts, culture, agriculture, industry, the economy, systems, literature, culture, and administration. This is the history of civilization. Therefore, political history is always the worst aspect of any nation's history, while cultural history encompasses what's always in the history of any nation. When you delve into politics, it's all wars, conflicts, conspiracies, betrayals, coups, revolutions, problems. This is true for all nations, not just the Islamic nation. No, this applies to all nations. And cultural history, it's always the bright side, what we've created in terms of inventions, machines, innovations, technological devices, management systems, culture, poetry, art, music, architecture, construction, and so on. And what's with this makes the oppressive ruler appear as if he's doing a great job. So, if you want to praise a ruler, whoever he may be, look at him from a civilizational perspective. See what he did in his time, or what happened during his reign. Those who want to beautify the image of rulers use this approach. And if you want to distort the image of a good ruler, you can use political history. But of course, this is something whose intention is known to be falsification, deception, distortion, embellishment, and hypocrisy, depending on the context. But the point is, this is political history and this is civilizational history. So, when someone asks me, which is more important, political history or civilizational history, the answer is political history is more important because it guides civilizational history. The constant, ongoing trend in history is that people follow the religion of their rulers, and you usually have civilizational history when you have political stability, because during times of war, crises, coups, instability, and storms, people are unable to establish a civilization. This is natural. Humans don't create or innovate unless they feel secure. Therefore, Civilizations arose in stable societies, societies along riverbanks, societies
ولكن
where governments were established. This is natural.
بكلم عدد
But let me say that I am now addressing an
حقيقة كل ميسر لما
unlimited number of people. Yes, it is true that everyone is facilitated for what they were created for. What does this mean? It means that for activists, reformers, those who seek
وحملة الرسالة وأصحاب
change,
المطالب
those who carry the message, those who struggle and
بالنسبة لهم التاريخ السياسي
fight, the most important thing is
بتشوف فيه كيف
political history. This is what you see in it: how
كيف تتحول
states rise, how states fall, how
الدولة
movements transform from advocacy,
فتفشل على رغم ما
how they
فيه
succeed, how they fail, how they are defeated, despite the presence of reformers who carry a message, those who want to
مكانه ويغير مجتمعه
change the world, change their country, change their place, change their society. They must understand political history. It contains its lessons, in which we find the laws of rise and the laws of fall, the laws of wars and the laws of conflict. In other words, to know how to change, how to reform,
لكن الداعية
how to open up a country, you need to study political history. The preacher, the preacher is closer to
النشاط المجتمعي وأقرب
science, closer to community activism, closer to raising children and educating the youth. This is what is most beneficial and appropriate for him.
معركة كفاح
Civilizational history, that is, anyone who intends to enter the battle of struggle, change, and reform in reality must understand political history. This is the most important thing for him. A man who doesn't possess these talents, or who doesn't have this subject in mind, he wasn't created for this, he wasn't made for this, and yet he wants to explain history. He will find his students in civilizational history. This is the one who comes to tell us how so-and-so sought knowledge, how so-and-so traveled to it, how so-and-so developed this idea into an invention, how so-and-so absorbed the knowledge of his predecessors and added to it from his own, how so-and-so solved this scientific problem, how so-and-so did to form a scientific team, how much he spent on translation, how much he spent on establishing astronomical observatories, how the ruler of old used to gather the most important scholars of the state in his court, and how intellectual debates took place before him. Civilizational history is the history of Renaissance in the context of community activity and specifically educational and reformist advocacy within these circles. Cultural history is paramount. However, if you're looking at a broader perspective, to determine what's more important, political history is generally more significant. Cultural history is subordinate to political history. Whenever there are wars, problems, coups, and revolutions, you'll find a temporary cultural pause. Once stability is achieved, cultural history begins to emerge and flourish. Then, if a political collapse occurs, cultural history continues to rise, but then, influenced by it, it stagnates. Sometimes, a corrupt ruler or a ruler who fails to fulfill their duties corrupts and stifles cultural history. I'll give you a famous example, one I've cited many times, to the point of fear I'll tire of it. For instance, in al-Jabarti's history, the historian Abd al-Rahman speaks of his father, the great Hassan al-Jabarti, as a learned scholar in astronomy, fashion, and engineering. Even European students would come to him to study. This was at the end of the 8th century. People from France were even coming to an Agharite sheikh. He studied engineering and astronomy with him. And this is the same al-Jabarti who is telling this story about his father, the same one whose country was swept away by the French armies in the French campaign. So, folks, were they coming to learn from us, or were they already more advanced than us and then came and swept us away? Which is it? Al-Jabarti picks up on this and says, because when these Franks returned to their countries, they took this knowledge and put it into practice. They had a political system there that benefited from science and transformed it into weapons, but the rule in Egypt at that time, which was the rule of the Mamluks in their final era, under the Ottomans in their final era, was a corrupt regime. They had this knowledge, but it was only on paper, in books. It wasn't invested into create weapons, tools, and inventions that would enable us to repel these armies. Therefore, the truth is that when the French occupied Algeria, the number of illiterate people in France was greater than the number of illiterate people in Algeria, and the same thing happened when they occupied Egypt. So where was the problem? The problem wasn't simply a lack of scientific advancement, but there was a corrupt political system, and this is the political history of that system. The corrupt politician couldn't utilize existing knowledge to develop militarily and culturally, so he was overtaken by people even more ignorant than himself. In our time, this is clear. You find brilliant inventors who can't find a place for themselves in the Arab world. Where do they go? They go to Europe and America. Europe and America invest this knowledge and science in manufacturing weapons that kill us. Yes, us. It's very, very possible that the scientist who invented something and added something used it to kill his own people in his home country. Political history is more important than cultural history because it guides it, but everyone is suited to what they were created for. Some can benefit from political history, and some can benefit from cultural history. I want you to take a deep breath. Yes, because I'm going to ask you a question that will lead you into a hornet's nest, so prepare yourself. This question isn't over yet, because there's another frightening aspect to it. May God protect us. This political and cultural history is creating digital conflicts on social media in ways that are unimaginable. So, Professor Muhammad, I'm a man who lives in my brother, a country where a ruler is labeled politically unjust, yet simultaneously considered incredibly intelligent, brilliant, generous, and civilized. So, I'm sitting here on Instagram and Facebook, whatever you want to call it. If anyone dares to cross the line with our country, we'll all swarm, whether we're online trolls or not. Here, as a simple person, I live in this country with dignity and respect. I have electricity, water, a nice car, and so on. You see my ruler as a disaster, a devil incarnate. That's your problem, but for me, he's the best I could ask for, so please don't talk about us like that. Of course, I'm not targeting any specific country, but this kind of thinking seems to be widespread and prevalent, and it's causing an unnatural conflict on social media. We get into discussions we can't get out of, so we go to sleep, leaving the discussion unresolved. So, what am I supposed to do with this person? How can he understand this? How can he take sides? Should he take sides or not? And by the way, look, firstly, there might be a ruler who is a tyrant himself, a despot, an oppressor, and a mighty ruler, but who is genuinely keen on the advancement of his country. This exists in history, it exists in real-life examples. It's true he rules the country with an iron fist, but even while ruling with an iron fist, he is committed to its strength, elevation, and progress. This does exist, but what's the problem with this type of ruler? He establishes projects and states that almost collapse after him. You see, the project he initiates remains in place as long as the ruler is there, but if he's gone, these things begin to collapse because people become complacent, accepting humiliation, and cowardice and corruption take hold. These are the elements that cause states to crumble. This has been happening throughout history. It's normal. But what's happening in our time, or in our Arab world, is something else entirely. In our contemporary Arab world, we don't have such a ruler. What we have now is in
أخذوا منا الدنيا.
Reality, they've taken our religion and our worldly possessions, the outward appearances of progress found in some
ليست إلا
wealthy
استيرادا
countries are nothing
عند
but
الأجانب، ليست نهضة ذاتية.
imports of what foreigners have, a self-made renaissance. So you find that the manifestations of prosperity in our countries are, in reality, manifestations of occupation. And without mentioning names, as I said, for example, some books written by Americans explicitly state that this country is our cash cow. They wrote it and published it, meaning it's the cash cow we'll keep milking until we retire, or that so-and-so American minister agreed with so-and-so official in such and such country that we would be the ones handle the infrastructure or manage the facilities. This is a type they call long-term colonialism. You know, when you build your city or your administrative system on foreign technology, you don't just prefer, I mean, the contract isn't just for the construction itself, but everything that comes after the additions, facilities, expansions, and developments is tied to the foundation upon which it was built. So, for example, if you go to an agreement with an American company and then with a company in the Soviet Union, that's one thing, and that's another. If you go for Americans, it's different than for the Soviet Union. In both cases, building a city isn't a single contract of systems implemented for roads, telephones, sewage, and refrigeration and air conditioning are all based on your complete dependence on the entity that initiated the city's construction. So, what we see now in terms of material and architectural appearances isn't truly a genuine manifestation of material progress and development. Consider the tallest buildings, for example, or even the grandest mosques. Were those who built them Arab Muslims? Were those who designed them, brought the stones and the marble Arab Muslims? No, and those who maintain them and manage their facilities are Arab Muslims. This is and progress or development. It's importation, and importation in its entirety. It's a manifestation of occupation. Therefore, what the online trolls are doing now is largely ignorance and hypocrisy. No matter what happens, they were hypocrites, even those systems that have neither religion nor worldly affairs, focusing on appearances, meaning materialism itself. But what we're talking about is an independent, self-reliant civilizational renaissance. A prince, ruler, sultan, or king can establish it himself with engineers, architects, artists, and decorators. This means it doesn't derive its resources or its causes from its enemies. This is an important distinction. While I acknowledge that there might be a despotic ruler striving to elevate his country, there's a small branch here, so we can apply this to the question as well. We have a series called Questions in History, and we're studying history, and we're in a state of confusion. But it occurred to me you were speaking quickly. I know I'm going to ask a question that would take 3 hours to answer, but in 30 seconds is history a science, a special kind of science. Those who disagree on this say it is, of course, depending on their definition of the word science. Does science mean that it uncovers the unknown, for example, or does it mean that it has fundamental principles, consistent and that we can invest in it? What does that mean? For example, physics. Physics is the science of physics. If I know the laws of motion, I can build a car. History, yes, that's a science. So, your history has fixed, consistent rules that I can measure just like I measure The laws of motion. No, that's not our science. It's a school of thought. A second school of thought says no, it's a science because it reveals the unknown. I have something obscure, something I don't know. As soon as I discover a fossil, or a manuscript, or an artifact, I discover the unknown. So the thing I was ignorant of and learned, that's science. Therefore, it's like geology. Well, geology is a science, but you keep discovering and learning as you dig and excavate and see. Some people say that all the humanities are sciences of a special nature, meaning they don't have the precision, control, and consistency of the pure sciences, but I still can't say they're just talent and art. No, they are also sciences, and they have their fixed principles and rules that I can apply, and there are exceptions to this. So the humanities, they call them sciences of a special nature, have an aspect of science and an aspect of art and taste. This involves a degree of bias on the part of the historian, their humanity, and a degree of readings of history will certainly differ. But if a Muslim and a non-Muslim both study the same material in a lab, they will both come up with the same characteristics. Of course, there's more to it, but this isn't the time. Yes, that's right. So, history is a science of a special kind, in this sense. Ibn Khaldun, for example, spoke of it as both science and art. He sometimes mentioned it as a science, and sometimes as an art. When we follow, for example, the Arabs didn't have this distinction. The word art among the Arabs encompassed science. The word art among the Arabs encompassed the word science. Yes, history is an art, a cherished aspect of the Arab school of thought. History is a science, a cherished aspect of the Arab school of thought. And that's why, for example, Hajj Carliver wrote the book Kashf al-Zunan, which he wrote about the types of sciences, was titled Kashf al-Zunan and Istilahat al-Funan, the unveiling of doubts concerning the terminology of the arts. A word fan art among the Arabs meant science. Of course, when someone wants to, for example, trace the history of epidemics, if I were a doctor and wanted to trace the history of epidemics, when they appeared, where they appeared, how they developed, this is also ultimately information. Now, question 18. How do we differentiate, or if we want to focus on a science of history, is it political history or cultural history? And if we want to summarize this question, what can we say? Professor Muhammad, in one line, political history is more important than cultural history. Political history is more important for those working on reform and change, while cultural history is more important for those working in advocacy, education, and enlightenment. And so, the 7th episode of the 100 Questions in History series has ended, and we stopped at the 18th question. The 19th question, God willing, is extremely important and wonderful. It will be in the 8th episode, God willing. May God protect you. To watch more programs about, to learn about Islamic history, its events, victories, defeats, leaders and scholars, its secrets, governance, politics, wars, and battles, simply follow our YouTube channel, Our History. We explore history from the distant past to the distant